Antony and Cleopatra by William Shakespeare. A Shakespeare play that's kind of somewhat overshadowed, I think, by others of Shakespeare's works, and perhaps not without good reason. This is one of Shakespeare's Roman plays, along with Julius Caesar, to which this is something of a pseudo sequel, and Coriolanus. It is a tragedy slash romance chronicling the torrid love affair between Mark Antony of Rome and Cleopatra of Egypt and their eventual downfall. Now, this play is best remembered perhaps for the character of Cleopatra, who is often pointed to as being Shakespeare's finest female creation. Although to that I say that's not saying much, although we'll get to that. So, what is the story of Antony and Cleopatra? Well, Mark Antony, one of the leading figures of Rome, is dallying in Egypt with his side chick, the Queen Cleopatra, and he is kind of shirking his duties. And this sets him at odds with Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted son and the future Roman emperor. And there are some wars and some kind of background political stuff, but it culminates in Antony and Octavian going head to head because they do not really get along. And so it's Antony and Cleopatra on one side and Octavian and the rest of Rome on the other. And then Antony and Cleopatra are ultimately defeated, largely due to some very poor choices on their parts in the War of Actium, and they die as per usual with a Shakespeare tragedy. Now, the historical setting of this play is really where the majority of its interest lay for me. This is to me kind of like Shakespeare's other play, Romeo and Juliet, only a lot more raw and also with a lot higher stakes. So, if we compare Antony and Cleopatra to Romeo and Juliet, I think what you get is kind of a youthful versus a more adult version of a romance story. Romeo and Juliet is a very idyllic kind of love story about two teenagers madly in love with each other, and they die, but their love is very pure and kind of powerful. Antony and Cleopatra's love affair is not like that. They are both hot messes. They constantly make really bad decisions and they constantly play petty little games with each other to try to get a little dig in at the other, even though they do love each other. And it's much more authentic, I think, to genuine romance between people because it's a lot rougher and more uneven, but therefore more truthful and honest, I think. But as I said, the historical context of this is where my principal interest lay because the stakes of this story are quite high. If you don't know the history of the fall of the Roman Republic and the War of Actium, that is what this play is principally concerned with. The Roman Republic had been in decline for some time, largely thanks to Julius Caesar, the titular character of another Shakespeare play, who had kind of eroded the foundations of the Republic. And eventually, Octavian, Julius Caesar's adoptive son, completely did away with the republican nature of Rome and declared himself Palpatine style as emperor for life and consolidated power to himself. Although he did also make way for the Pax Romana, which is the era of Roman a long enduring era of Roman peace and prosperity, but kind of at the cost of freedom, I suppose. And the War of Actium, which was the war between Octavian and Mark Antony, was the final war before the Roman Republic collapsed or was, done away with, and Octavian asserted himself as supreme emperor. And so the stakes of this play, like I said, are kind of high because you have Mark Antony and Cleopatra over here as kind of the last bastions of freedom, I guess, although that's kind of oversimplifying it. But they're the last bulwarks that are holding the line against Octavian's quest for power. and obviously they lose, but it does make for a really kind of intriguing setup because, like I said, it's kind of like a Romeo and Juliet love story, only this love story has a lot bigger implications for the course, the trajectory of world events after Mark Antony's downfall. Now, this is to me a pretty mid Shakespeare play. To rate Antony and Cleopatra, I would have to give this like a C plus. It is not my favorite Shakespeare play, although it's far from his worst. It's just kind of in there in the middle, I think. I understand what Shakespeare was going for, I think, with this, but I think it kind of misses the mark. I don't think he was ever really able to achieve what he wanted to do with this. What he wanted to do, what he strove to do, was to portray Mark Antony and Cleopatra as kind of these larger than life, almost mythical figures. They have a tragic grandeur about them, and they're kind of, again, almost mythic in their proportions. But they never really live up to that. And I guess one could say that that might be kind of the point here is the juxtaposition between what these people Shakespeare's kind of making them out to kind of be versus the actual human foibles and shortcomings that they exhibit. But in the end, I just didn't really like Antony or Cleopatra either one. And so the tragic nature of this work was as a result lessened because it didn't hurt that bad to see what became of them because they were both dumb as hell. They were some dumbasses. And it's kind of their love is so tempestuous and you know it's just such a upheaval after upheaval between the two that they kind of undermine each other, whether intentionally or unintentionally. That they kind of just cause their own downfall. And again, I guess that's kind of the point. But honestly, I just didn't really care that much. I could not be brought to care for these characters who were so stupid and blind to kind of what should have been obvious. And I was predisposed to dislike Octavian, who is kind of the antagonist of this. If this has a villain, it's him, even though he's not particularly villainous, or at least not portrayed that way. If this work does have a villain, it's him because he is the antagonistic force who is trying to defeat and ultimately does defeat Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And I was kind of predisposed to not like him, knowing that he was the one who destroyed the Roman Republic and proclaimed himself to be Emperor Supreme forever. So that kind of predisposed me to not like him. But dang, if I actually didn't kind of root more for him towards the end of this, because at least he wasn't such a dumbass like Mark Antony and Cleopatra were. Um, the tragedy, it's just not that tragic to me. So towards the end of the play, there's a big sea battle, and if you wonder how Shakespeare is able to convey a battle at sea on a wooden stage. You'll just have to read it to find to find out. But Cleopatra kind of seemingly betrays Antony or something. It's kind of hard to understand what happens there, and so it goes pear shaped, and then Antony is really in the dumps. And there are some really moving speeches that Antony delivers towards the end of this play when he knows that the game is up and that all is lost and how dejected he is and how far he has fallen from his former glory. That's really good stuff, but by then it was just too little too late. I just didn't really like his character all that much or Cleopatra's. I did not like Cleopatra's character at all, and I am going to get to that. But even though there are a couple of good speeches in this, it's just not enough. And the tone of this is somewhat uneven as well. In fact, some people don't even really categorize this as a pure tragedy in the sense of like Hamlet or Macbeth. I think it is a tragedy, but it's a lot lighter in tone in the earlier portions, at least. In fact, it's kind of bawdy in the early parts of this play. There's lots of sex jokes, a lot of sexual jokes and sexual innuendo, which kind of adds a kind of a lightly comedic aura to it. but that gradually fades away until in the end it's meant to be something, really powerfully moving. Although for me it just wasn't, because I just wasn't that invested. But let's talk now about Cleopatra, because Cleopatra is the selling point for this play. Because, like I said in the beginning, she is pointed to so often as being Shakespeare's finest female creation. And as I said also in the beginning, that's not really saying much. Um, Shakespeare, as good of a writer as Shakespeare was, we always have to remember that he was nonetheless still a product of his time. And as a result of that, the female characters in his works don't really get the same shrift as the male characters. Now, there, of course, there are female characters in his works that are pretty memorable and somewhat fairly rounded as well, like Lady Macbeth. Uh, Comes to mind first and foremost. She's, the bloodthirsty, ambitious murderess, who eventually kind of her conscience just kind of destroys her and she comes undone towards the end of the play. She has a very interesting arc, and she actually does kind of propel a lot of the action of that play. But for the most part, Shakespeare's female characters, in the tragedies at least, I understand maybe in the comedies this is different, but in the tragedies, the female characters just don't carry that much weight. Ophelia in Hamlet, I mean, the defining attribute of her character is just that she dies. She doesn't do a whole lot. She doesn't get the same sweeping speeches that Hamlet does to round out her character and show us what she's like as a person. And like in King Lear, Cordelia, and that's one of the main problems I have with King Lear, is that it's so dichotomous in its portrayal of its female characters between the Madonna and the horror complex. Cordelia is just Little Miss Perfect. She doesn't have much depth, and she's kind of just used more as a plot device. But the difference between those plays and this one is that Cleopatra is possibly, in the tragedies at least, Shakespeare's one starring female character. That is to say, this play is actually about her, whereas in like King Lear, Cordelia kind of is used, to kind of make some things happen, but the play isn't about her, it's about Lear. With this play, the reason why Cleopatra is one half of the title of this play is because it's actually about her. And as a result of that, I think that is why her character is a little bit more memorable than Shakespeare's other ladies. But I still don't think that this character is really any great shakes, and I also don't think that he does a lot of justice with to women with this character, because she is so shallow and petty and histrionic and kind of melodramatic and kind of flighty and inconsistent that I could not be brought to like her. So at the end, when she kills herself, I just didn't care because she was annoying and I didn't like her character. But I do understand why she stands out among the ranks of Shakespeare's other female characters, because, as I said, the play is actually about her and she does make a lot of the things happen, even if she makes some really bad choices in this. But still, the way that he portrays her character is not very dignified. It's not very queenly. It's not very regal. And it's pretty far removed from what I would assume the real life Cleopatra was probably like. This is more like a hormonal teenage girl drama queen antics, and it's just not very likable, at least. She constantly does the most vain and shallow things and acts just kind of flighty and stupid all the time. I just didn't like the character. And so, again, I don't really think this character shines that much brighter than any of the other female characters that Shakespeare created, except insofar as that she is actually the main character. But this play overall, I liked it okay, but again, it's not one of my favorites. I'd give it a C plus. It's a very mid tier Shakespeare play for me. It was at times unbelievably hard to understand. I think King Lear is still the hardest of Shakespeare's plays that I've read, in that the language, for whatever reason, I just found very impenetrable. This was right on par with that, though, because there are so many places in this play where Shakespeare uses words in such a way that they can be taken in more than one manner. As well, in the footnotes of my edition, which is the Signet Shakespeare edition, there were a lot of times where the commentators just put question marks, but they were like, "We don't really know what Shakespeare meant with this." And there was actually a couple of times, I believe, where Shakespeare just made up some words. Like the commentators were like, "We don't even know what this word means." And so, as a result of that, this was a really dense and kind of inscrutable play. I had to refer to the footnotes on almost every line because there were so many places where I didn't understand what he was trying to say. That's not necessarily a criticism of it, except kind of just to me personally, because it made it really difficult to read, even if I did kind of get the broad strokes of it. But yeah, I think it could have maybe been trimmed a little bit. It's fairly lengthy, um, but I think there were some scenes that there were a lot of micro scenes in this, especially towards the end where there were just one brief, tiny little snatches of scenes that are just kind of propelling the action, which maybe didn't even need to be in there. I think this could have been again trimmed a little bit. But such as it was, the tragedy was not that tragic, although I did appreciate the historical significance of this and how it was kind of portrayed as these mythical, although direly flawed figures who are kind of holding the line against a tyrant, and kind of undoing themselves, and so subsequently setting the course of the Roman Empire, at least on the path of being an empire instead of a republic. And I get that, and the War of Actium kind of being like that last foothold before the demise of the Roman Republic. I get that, and that was the most interesting part of it to me. But overall, like I said, I'm just not really quite as enamored of this Shakespeare play. Um, there were characters in this that just died for no apparent reason. It's never explained how or why they died. And there were just so many places where I think things could have been a little bit tighter. And I think that this is one of the rare times where Shakespeare's reach exceeded his grasp, because I understood what he was going for, but it just didn't connect for me. But it's not by any means terrible, and again, I would give it a C plus. So yeah, Antony and Cleopatra by William Shakespeare. Have you read or seen performed Antony and Cleopatra? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything that I've said about it. And if you have not read Antony and Cleopatra, I might could recommend it, but only if you're like really into Shakespeare, because this doesn't really have many. Actually, I don't think it had any of the really famous, well-known, iconic lines like "to be or not to be" or what have you. It was much less memorable in that respect. But you might still find something in it to like, and you might like it more than I did. So just if it sounds like it's up your alley, go for it. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.